Hello everyone and welcome to my library. If you're new here, hello, my name is Chinsia, and if you're one of my lovely regulars, hi, how are you? I hope you're doing fabulously. So today we are doing the long-standing tradition of the Books That Made Me series. I do these every year, where I tend to wrap up the books that were most influential to me, and that normally comes at a positive note. However, I've had quite a bad reading year this year, but it doesn't mean that the books that I read, despite being, a topic of criticism from me, despite everything, has been a very important year for me in my progression, as a human. Isn't every year, but definitely for me there's been some significant shifts, and with that it affected my reading, but I think I've become stronger and more assertive in what I want from life, and particularly what I want from books. And I have quite a few books to discuss with you today that are on effectively my naughty list. There is, I think, one, maybe two or so that I will praise, but I'm going to look at my list on Goodreads and showcase you the best and the worst of, the books that I read this year. I only read around 50 books this year. At the time I'm recording this video, I'm about to reach my 50th book. But that's not very much for me. It's been a bit of a fuddy-duddy year this year. But I think it was, worthwhile, particularly when it comes to evaluating what I'd like to read. I'd certainly like to read more in the new year. And if that's the same for you, then aren't you in luck? Because today's sponsor is actually Blinkist, which will help you get further in your reading goals next year. Take it away, Editing Chinsia, and let's talk about what Blinkist is and how it can improve your reading in 2022. So, what is Blinkist? Well, if you're not familiar, Blinkist is actually this professional book summary service that allows you to understand the key insights in some of the top non-fiction books within 15 minutes or less. So say you're someone who struggles to read non-fiction books in general, we've all been there, or you're someone who's, too busy to make time to read, and you're so overwhelmed with how many books are being released all the time that you just can't sit down, you can't make your mind up, and you can't decide what you want to read, if you have time to read it, etc., and you just don't want to waste your money on books that may not work out for you. Well, Blinkist is here to help you, because for starters, nothing irritates me more than buying a non-fiction book that has been marketed and presented as one way, and then finding out halfway through reading it that it doesn't cover what I hoped it would. Blinkist in that instance is a lifesaver when it comes to saving money on books, because at least I can get an insight into a book by either reading the blink or listening to the blink and understanding what the book covers and deciding afterwards if I want to buy it or not. But Blinkist isn't just about summarising books. It has podcasts and discounted audiobooks, which I was very pleasantly surprised to find out. So I actually use Blinkist to learn about topics that I don't have enough time for, or basically the mental capacity to sit down and read about. I have so many other priorities. So at the moment, I'm actually fascinated by Russia, and I don't have much time to read about Russia. I'm actually currently listening to a summary of Simon Montefiore's Romanovs, and I'm also quite eager to listen to The Fate of Rome by Karl Harper, and also this book called Russian Roulette, which is an insight into the story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump. So Blinkist is a fantastic way for you to introduce yourself to subjects and topics that you're unfamiliar with. So whether you want to learn about ancient history or the Chinese economy, Blinkist basically has you covered. So right now, Blinkist has a special offer for my audience. So if you click the link in my description box, you can start a 7-day free trial with Blinkist and also get 25% off a premium membership with Blinkist. So thank you so much for Blinkist for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back into it. So I'm going to start on a positive note because the majority of this video is going to be slightly more negative in some kind of way, and I'm going to talk about the first book I read this year, and arguably the best book I read this year. It was Tracking Classical Monsters in Popular Culture by Liz Gloyn. Liz Gloyn was one of my lecturers back in my undergraduate years, and she's a fantastic lecturer. She's no longer at that university, but she wrote a book all about contemporary representations of classical monsters, and it was fascinating. This is a perfect read for anyone who's interested in popular culture, and that includes music, film, theatre, etc., books, literature. Particularly if you're a fan of the Percy Jackson series, there's a whole section on that, which I will admit I skimmed over because I had no idea what that series is about. It's not something I've read. However, the rest of it I found absolutely fascinating, even though the theatre pieces and films that I hadn't seen. So if you're someone, even if you are, well versed in, the classical realm, and you understand the connections between the two, but you're not exactly, familiar with the actual media representations of them, which was my case, or vice versa, you are someone who's far more into, the media representations, but you have no real classical understanding of them. This is the perfect intermediate book. Liz does a fantastic job. She's an incredibly easy person to read. There's no, qualms about it. There's no pretentiousness about it. It's extremely accessible, but also very in-depth. But again, before we get into a negative one, I thought I read this book last year. I am incredibly confused as to this being on my list for this year. It feels like so long ago since I read this book that I'm fascinated with the idea that I read it this year. But again, we're starting with another, positive. The fourth book of the year that I read was Spillover by David Quammen. And this is all about epidemiology for anyone who's interested in it. Again, here, most people credit him for effectively, predicting the COVID-19. He predicted it many years ago, but I would say that when you look at the data, it's quite easy to predict that there would be a mass pandemic on the horizon based on what his book and the data shows you. I'm obviously not an epidemiologist. It's not something that's my natural claim, but I found it absolutely fascinating to read about. It was terrifying at the same time. Also, every single story that they were, diseases that I'd heard of when I was younger but didn't really go into depth with, and it just sent me on a little, dark path down the epidemiology route, and I should have stayed there. I was on a good path at the beginning of the year reading about non-fiction, but no, I ventured into the world of fiction and I resented myself for it afterwards. But again, highly recommended, even if you have absolutely no, background experience in any kind of scientific field, which includes me. I'm not someone who's familiar with this non-fiction world of epidemiology and biology and microorganisms and diseases and all that jazz. Highly recommended. It's incredibly interesting to read. I wasn't bored at all. I can't remember a single moment of being bored during that read. So I can't fault it, in all honesty. But then let's get into the first disaster of the year, really. Let's get into Essays of Love by Alain de Botton. Most people know of Alain de Botton by The School of Life on YouTube. I was really into that channel many years ago. Will admit, I went off it for some unknown reason. I wasn't really connecting with the philosophies that were being presented in it. And after reading this book, I feel like I almost went backwards. And I realised what I disliked about the current state of affairs with the School of Life. I'm not saying it's a bad channel, by any means it's not. There was something on about it that I wasn't exactly, I wasn't really vibing with. And then when I read this book, I cannot believe it's still in print. It would be so embarrassing. If this were my first book published, which it is for Alain de Botton, this was his first book. I believed he was, fresh out of like Cambridge University and all that jazz. Or he wrote it in whenever it got published. It's an absolute cringe fest. And I can't imagine anyone openly admitting to the way this person speaks. It's atrocious. I couldn't believe that someone would proudly have this book displayed, reprinted, in circulation. I thought it was a horrible showcasing of his personality. It was just basically a snobbish man belittling a woman the entire time, who's apparently he's in love with, but everything about her, he's the most pretentious. It's like, that joke where they go, oh, I can't believe I made out with her. She went to a comprehensive school. That is effectively this book. But it's presented as romance, and everything about it is so toxic. Alain de Botton is apparently so in love with this girl, but she's beneath him. And that's a phrase that he kind of uses. I'm not sure if he directly says beneath him, but basically that's what you get from this. She's not intelligent enough. She's not as intelligent as him. She's very much common. She dresses commonly. She reads common literature, and yet he's so in love with her. And yet when she inevitably ends things with him, because he must have put her down so much for the music that she listened to, for how he openly asks her on several occasions, and he doesn't phrase it in a way that he's critical of his past self. He admits that he asked her to change what she was wearing to go out. He didn't want to be seen in public with her. But that's presented as nothing but no fault of him. That's just how he is. How could you possibly want that known to the public? I thought it was utterly embarrassing. And then, as it tells, she inevitably breaks up with him. He then writes a suicide note and tries to take his own life, but he does it very poorly. I think he tries to overdose on vitamin D tablets. I'm spoiling it for you because you shouldn't read this book unless you really want to feel like toxic shame and secondhand embarrassment all the time. And as he's, overdosing on vitamin D, he hopes that she feels guilty for what she did to him. Like, his intention is revenge on her in some way. And of course, There's no self-reflection in this book. It's the most toxic, horrible experience of a human being. I was like, really? That's the type of person that... Now I've read that book, I can't look at that channel anymore, because now I've seen this and it's being published and it's out and about in the world. No. Why? No, it was a terrible, terrible book. I had to read it out of sheer, it's like toxic curiosity. I'm like, this can't be real. There's going to be a redemption arc. He's going to wake up and realize how horrific he's been as a human being. No, not at all. It's presented as a true modern romance. And people wonder why I'm not into romance. Speaking of pretentious books that I thought would be worth more, The Mighty Dead, Why Homer Matters by Adam Nicholson. Again, I thought it'd be a reflection on, literally as the title suggests, why Homer matters. But rather, this is just a really self-indulgent autobiography about why Homer matters to a man who likes sailing around places. But it's all incredibly self-indulgent. It doesn't reflect on the importance of classical literature or classical history in contemporary society whatsoever. It doesn't promise that at all. It was just the ramblings of a self-indulgent, again, pretty pretentious person who thought they were the main figure of this book, when I don't know who they are. I don't care about them. I wanted to see someone analyse why Homer matters today. Why does it... No, I didn't... No, just for them. They're like, their father took them out on boats or something along those lines. I can't remember. It was the beginning of the year. I just remember reading, and it's badly written as well. I'm good with an autobiography that's well written, but not one that's badly written. It just dragged on. Like, give me Jerome K. Jerome, Three Men on a Boat any day. I'm not taking this over that. Like, really. I think that's what they were trying to do, but with a Homeric twist. No. It was just so self-indulgent. It was really badly marketed. If I knew it was going to be about this random person's life who thought way too highly of themselves, I really would not be interested in it. So I wouldn't have picked it up. Highly do not recommend. A good fiction book that I read this year, however, is a very punchy little one that's, it leaves you still thinking about it. It's Assembly by Natasha Brown. I believe it's her first book published. She's a young British black writer, but she talks about the idea of, from the narrator, it's an unnamed narrator, discussing their romantic relationship with a white man who's very upper class, and this dynamic of contemporary Britain from the perspective of a young black woman, and this navigation of, London life, making money, climbing up the social ladder, and this disconnect between who she is and where she's come from versus what she's walking into and how people view her. It's not something that you come away feeling good about yourself in any shape or form. And I say that obviously as a white person here, but at the same time, it's quite a hopeless book. But at the same time, it highlights a lot of issues that people don't want to talk about. But it's beautifully written and it's very punchy, to the point. It's just poignant and very from the gut. There's no emotional play here. It's just quite frank, and I love that kind of book where it's just like, just telling it as it is. I read a lot of bad fiction this year. Oh God, The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. Oh... Oh, I really dislike this book. It was one of the popular ones. And again, I've said this in a previous video, but I'm really resenting these books that are marketed as feminist classical retellings. And they are not that at all. They are just this weird, what people think feminism should be, or, girl power kind of crap. It's not about equality. It's not about moving the needle in any shape or form. It's just a marketable gimmick. And it doesn't add any context, it doesn't add any narrative, it doesn't add any more, to the conversations that we've been having for hundreds of years, or particularly in the past 50 years, I would say. It's just static, still feminism. And I would say The Silence of the Girls was that. And actually, it was worse than that, in my opinion. It's not well written, it's average. It's not exceptional. It's pretty an average, but okay, I'm not gonna say it's bad. It's just average. That's okay. Starts out telling the tale of Briseis, which we all know from the Iliad is Achilles' prize, and then it just stops telling the tale of Briseis, and Briseis then tells us Achilles' story and Patroclus' story. And I know Patroclus' story. I know Achilles' story. I'm done with rereading the Iliad over and over and over again. And changing the narrator to a female does F all to anything. Just because it's a woman telling the story doesn't make it meaningful, doesn't make it feminist, it didn't add anything. Nothing that was already known or presupposed. There was no emotional weight. There was no like emotional drama. It was just as it was. And if anything, some of the things that she did with Achilles was borderline pretty creepy. I mean, we know Achilles is like a wanker. We know he's not a very nice character. He's a crybaby. What I call when I read Homer's Achilles, he's a blinking crybaby. He's having a strop and it's really embarrassing. We don't like Achilles. I've never liked Achilles. The only time I started liking Achilles was from Madeline Miller's version of, the Song of Achilles. That's the first time I've ever liked Achilles. But Pat Barker takes us back to the original Achilles, what we know from Homer's Iliad. I'm absolutely fine with, because that's how he's presented in that book, so I would expect him to be that. But some of the commentary about him, there's a weird infantilization of him in sex scenes, which is just very creepy. Like, if the genders were reversed, that's not okay. And I still think it's not okay. And I was like, why was that put there? That made me feel really quite gross. Another book that, made me this year, because it made me angry. And I don't want this author, if they ever see this, to think it's a criticism of them as a skill, because there's pros and cons, and I think that's what made it probably the most emotive read of mine, and that's Charlotte Higgins's Greek Myths, a retelling, which is again another anthology. We have so many anthologies. We have Stephen Fry's, you know how I feel about Stephen Fry's as well, Mythos. It was okay, nothing to brag about. I was pedantic and picky over it. And we've had Natalie Haynes as well. Pandora's Jar I actually really enjoyed. I believe that's one of my books have made me last year. But then this is actual retelling anthology, and it's told from the perspective of, not really told actually from the perspective of, each chapter is a female figure weaving. That could be Penelope, it could be Athena, it could be Helen of Troy, it could be Alcathoi. These collections are weaving, and what they're weaving are tapestries that feature myths. And I will credit Charlotte where credit is due. What Higgins does with the collection and the compendium of the myths as itself, structurally, how they flow into one another, is the best I've seen. Like, she has done the best job with the structure and formation and giving a flow to these very eclectic Greek myths. And I give full credit there. I don't think anyone's done it as well as she has. But her choices were quite strange to me. And I feel like the book, it's presented as, again, it's marketed as a feminist retelling. And it was effectively a redemption arc for a lot of crappy male characters in the mythology, which I'm like, why? Why are we doing this? At the same time, at the expense of other people's stories that are actually greatly overlooked. For an example, Perseus, the chap who killed Medusa. Medusa is, a story that everyone has sympathy for, regardless of your state on feminism and all that jazz. It's a very tragic myth, and it's a very sad myth that hasn't been given as much airtime until the past, I would say, 50 years. So because she's such an overlooked character, particularly in the traditional anthologies and all that jazz, you would expect her to have a lot more airtime, a lot more literary breathing space, as it were. But she's given 3 lines in the entirety of this compendium, whereas Perseus gets 10 plus pages of story. And to me, again, I was expecting something else. I was expecting a more emotive narrative, but Higgins even admits in her introduction that this isn't a psychological retelling from the perspective of what, a contemporary novelist may do. A contemporary novelist may, want to explore the emotive feelings of what it is like to be ex-woman in a traditional, mythological story setting, and give them more space. Higgins admits that it's not that. So to my question really is, what's the point in it then? Why make another anthology of a group of mythologies that we know of and people have read, other than to change the position of them? But in actual fact, even though Higgins says that her intention wasn't to explore the psychology of it, there's a lot of shifting blame back in a way that I found very regressive. And it just confused me. I just thought, why? What's the point of this? And I had many issues with it. There was just, I think I phrased it in my Goodreads review as a squashing down and sterilization of the myths. It was almost like a kumbaya moment where no one has bad intentions except the gods. We're all just like, we all just had a misunderstanding between all of us. Both men and we just had misunderstandings. None of us had ill intentions. It was all good. I'm like, Agamemnon was a good guy. He was not interested. In fact, they nearly called off the war, apparently, to this book because they just didn't want to kill off Iphigenia. Really? We were going to... What? So, I had a lot of issues with that. I thought, let's embrace the blood-curdling cruelty of humanity. I like that part of the myths. Let's call bitchiness as it is. Let's call bitchy behaviour. Let's call out bad. Why do we have to, soften it down? Why does it have to be sterilised? So, yeah, that's how I feel about that. I had a lot more to say than I realised. But let's end on a good note. I'm going to highlight 2 of the books that I really enjoyed. Again, they are classics related. So the first one I think needs way more hype than it's getting. It's The Giant Dark. Sarvat Hassin. I really hope I didn't butcher her name, but it's actually a really good retelling. Again, this is a retelling of the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, but it's set in contemporary London and it's gender swapped. So Orpheus is presented by a rock star Pakistani woman, and Eurydice is her lover and her boyfriend of long-standing time. And I think she does a really funky job with it. The dynamics of what they do, the discussions about race, gender, class, all that jazz, very well done, highly entertaining. I found it a really entertaining myth. And again, it's very unusual to find a mythological retelling that I enjoy that much because most of them feel quite sterile. And again, if you like the sound of the Liz Gloyn book that I mentioned at the beginning, the only other book that came on par with that, and I read 2. So I read Donna Zuckerberg's Not All White Men, which I was actually really disappointed about because my main critique of this was that I expected an analysis of how classics plays in contemporary social and political society from both left and right wing, and it wasn't. How do I explain this? Most of it was an analysis on internet culture and how classics plays the internet culture, but the majority of the quotes came from random male bloggers and just random Reddit forums, and I don't know. I wanted to look at something more systemic than that. Not, yes, people are nasty on the internet and they say rude things. And I get that. And I know it's a culture and it's worth analysing. At the same time, because it's such a flippant source, because we can't actually, I think, very much like my Rome video, we don't know when someone is trolling. If someone's just saying something for shock factor, or if they actually believe in it, that's very hard when you're analysing bloggers or people on Quora or Reddit. Yes, they may be saying atrocious crap, but it's very hard to align that with real life impact and how that actually translates itself into, cultural society and all that level. And I find, whilst it's an interesting study, I found it a weak study because I couldn't see beyond, well, these are just random usernames that we're analysing here using, it's interesting if you're interested in how classical culture is playing in certain communities, like the incel community and all that jazz. That's what it's basically first up. But it wasn't what I was looking for, so I didn't enjoy it. However, Antigone Rising by Helen Morales is excellent. And again, everyone who read this for my book club over on Patreon really enjoyed it. Really niche stuff that I hadn't heard about. From Mexico to contemporary films to internet culture, it was all about, like Beyonce. Helen Morales looks at how classical influences are actually reflected or even completely inverted in contemporary media and society, and whether that's politics, sociopolitics, it's really, really interesting. Again, extremely accessible, highly entertaining, and I just found it's a very brief book, but I would recommend it to everyone to read. I think it was probably my favourite of the reads of this year. Because again, I learned so much. It was stuff that, I'm familiar with what she's talking about, but I didn't know anything about the examples that she gave. I found them really unique. And again, it's just a fascinating insight into how classics is playing out in contemporary society. So I think that will wrap up my books that made me, because there's a few more books on this list that made me angry again. And I realised I could just go on and on about how bad my reading year was. But we're going to stop there because I think we're done. But thank you very much. I'm sorry it was more negative than positive this year, but I thought it'd be an interesting take on the books that made me, because again, I've written quite a lot about these books that have angered me in some way, or I felt, disappointed in. They've actually been a really great starting point for a lot of my analytical writing. Basically how classical reception is being marketed, how it's being looked at, and what people are choosing to highlight, all that jazz. It's just a really interesting socio-political look at literature for me. So it has been influential in that way, but just not in a positive way. More, well, it is in a positive way for me as a writer and, you know, someone who's researching into this, but it wasn't a great reading year as a whole. I wasn't enjoying the reading I was doing. I was just getting angry by the reading I was doing, or frustrated, or disappointed, and whatnot. But thank you so much for watching, and thank you Blinkist for sponsoring today's video, and please check out the link down below, and I will see you tomorrow for another Vlogmas video, and remember, books save lives, so keep reading.